how did you get your start in journalism?
Well, actually, it was racing that got me into journalism because my parents were going to races when my mother was pregnant with me. It's the only place they could get me to quit crying and sleep till I was a year old was in the infield under the loudspeaker at Asheville-Weaverville. And so I grew up as a daddy's girl, helping him with the cars and all, and I loved racing. And so when I was 13, I decided I wanted to be a motorsports rider, or sports rider, preferably a motorsports rider. I learned very quickly I needed to broaden my horizons if I was going to get a job. But eventually it did work out to where I got to focus strictly on covering auto racing, and that was what I'd wanted to do since I was 13 years old. So not many people get their dream job.
NASCAR scene holds such a special place in the hearts of race fans. What was it like being a part of NASCAR scene?
You know, it's interesting in that I had Ricky Rudd's oldest sister tell me one time when I was working for United Press International and I was wanting to cover racing full-time, and she said, "You will find that this is a very hard community to get into, but once you're in it and they find out you're good at your job, you will always have a job in the community," because she said, if you notice, we just recycle people. But I honestly do consider it my family. We're all like brothers and sisters in the media center, and that's the way that I view the racing community. They are my family. And, you know, it's kind of like, we may fuss and fight each other, but nobody better tackle us from the outside. So it is a very small community and family, more so than people, I think, realize.
Over the years, you've been able to sit down with just so many, the who's who, in motorsports. Is there either a particular interview or maybe a person that stands out to you as just your favorite?
Well, growing up, I was a Rex White fan, and then I was a Richard Petty fan. And so it was interesting the first time that I got to go to Petty Enterprises and interview Richard Petty when I was with United Press International. And it was like, oh man, I've dreamed of doing this since I was 13 years old, and this is so great. And it was interesting because 2 years later, the state photo editor and I went back to Petty Enterprises for another interview, sit down with Richard. And after we got in the vehicle, I said, I think that interview went a lot better than the one 2 years ago. And he looked at me and he said, why don't you? And I said, no, why? And he said, because the first time you came here as a fan, and you had always dreamed of interviewing Richard Petty. This time you came as a journalist, and that made all the difference. So, it was really hard when I first started out covering drivers that I had admired growing up and had seen to now having to ask them questions and all. That was difficult initially. So when there was a generation change and the drivers that came along were more equivalent to my age, it made it much more easier to ask the questions. But, the one event that always stands out in my mind was covering Richard Petty's 200th win, July 4th, 1984 at Daytona, because it was just such a special day with President Reagan being there. It was the first time a sitting president had ever attended a NASCAR race, and sitting there in the press box covering the race and seeing Air Force One land at the Daytona International Speedway. I still have a framed photo of that up at my house with Richard Petty coming off turn 2 and Air Force One landing. And then it gave me an opportunity to interview people that I wouldn't have ever had the opportunity to interview, such as Burt Reynolds when they were filming Stroke or Ace. So it's been a dream.
That's awesome. Well, what advice would you give to someone who is looking to get into NASCAR journalism or just journalism as a whole?
Journalism has changed so much since I first started my profession, and the entryway into it is not really the steps that I took, which was working on the student newspaper and getting a summer job at a newspaper and starting at a non-daily and then working my way up. And now you can build your brand through social media, having your TikTok and Twitter and Instagram accounts, and you can build your brand that way. But you still have to have the fundamentals, and that is you have to have integrity. You can't tell somebody something is off the record and then run it, because you've ruined your reputation then, and people won't deal with you. If you're covering something, abide by the rules of that, and by that I mean if you're going to cover a federal trial, don't try to sneak your telephone or your electronics into the courtroom, because all you'll do is make the U.S. Marshals mad at you. So, if it's not a profession where you're going to make a lot of money unless you go the TV route. TV people make more money than print people. But I wouldn't trade it for the profession that I've had. I've been very blessed. I've had a very blessed career. And someone asked me, said, when are you going to retire? And I said, when I die. Because that's the way I feel about it. As long as I'm enjoying what I'm doing and I'm still having fun, then why not continue to do it? And, you'll get to meet people and experience things that otherwise you'll never get to. The really great thing about being a journalist is you're covering history. You're getting to experience what historians will look at firsthand. You are on the threshold of history, and you're experiencing it, and you're covering it. And just face it, what you write will be around forever.
That's great. And final question, do you have a favorite NASCAR paint scheme of all time?
Oh, geez, paint scheme.
Or a few. You can put a few if it's easier.
I wouldn't say I have a favorite paint scheme. I would say that my favorite paint scheme is a paint scheme that I can see on the backstretch at Daytona and Talladega. Because what happens is a lot of your corporate people come in and they'll design a paint scheme that they think looks really good on that computer, but you can't see it on the racetrack, and particularly on the backstretch at Daytona and Talladega. That's where Sam Bass was so good, was Sam could look at a paint scheme and say, that won't work because it'll get lost on the backstretch. And they didn't really understand that until they got out there and all of a sudden they couldn't see their paint scheme on the backstretch. But, the thing that's frustrating now regarding paint schemes is the fact that you really don't have a company that buys the whole season anymore. And it's frustrating because used to I would recognize cars by paint schemes. Richard Petty's paint scheme was always easy to find. So was the Wood Brothers Purolator paint scheme. And Dale Earnhardt's paint scheme when it was Wrangler, and then when it was GM Goodwrench. Those were paint schemes. If you couldn't see the number on the car, you knew who it was because of the paint scheme. And that's what's really frustrating in our current era of racing, is the fact that sometimes the paint schemes change every week or every other week, and sometimes you have two out there with the same one, particularly if Bass Pro's got two cars out there. So it's more difficult now to cover the races at the bigger tracks because of the paint schemes changing.